Okay, welcome everyone to this continuation of what are my favorite theorems. My very biased collection, my favorite fields, or whatever you want to call it. It's a very biased collection anyway, so whatever I call it, this is very biased. Yeah, so today I would like to talk about discrete analysis and one of my favorite theorems of the century so far related to discrete analysis. It's fantastic. So somehow, let me start with a little bit of ramble. Somehow, kind of mathematics, how it's taught, is very far behind of what is kind of really interesting. Really interesting is comes in huge quotation marks because what is really interesting depends a little bit on your personal taste, obviously. But I'm somehow always very surprised how far behind kind of school or university mathematics is compared to what people really do. Okay. But not just that. If you look at kind of the problems the community found interesting like 20 years ago, they're like very different from the problems that the community finds interesting nowadays. So kind of the development is like ridiculously fast and things change a lot. So there's this idea of exponential growth in research, and not just maybe in research, but also somehow in the topics of research. So things are trendy for a way shorter time than they were trendy like 100 or 150 years ago. So somehow if you think about the Hilbert problems that were kind of, Hilbert gave them around in 1900, they were still kind of really interesting research topics like for 60 years or something, so for quite a while. Which is very impressive because if you just think about how fast things change, so staying interesting for 60 years is quite impressive. Don't get me wrong, if you solve one of the open ones today, you still get a lot of credit, but they are not quite of the main focus of research anymore, if you want. And like in the 2000s, we had kind of the analog, which was kind of those Millennium Prize problems, the ones where you get $1 million. And they're essentially already outdated at this point. I probably shouldn't say that, so a lot of people will disagree with that. But a lot of more interesting modern problems that you should think should be on this list are not on this list, simply because the field is developing so fast. And questions that were not on the radar of most people 20, 25 years ago, or whenever you watch this video, it might be actually way further in the past. But anyway, at this point, like 25 years ago, yeah, so things change and the list probably should be updated at one point. And I'll show you one of my favorites of this century so far as we go along in this video. But again, this is a very biased list. So if you disagree and you're a big fan of the Hodge conjecture, go for the Hodge conjecture, obviously. But anyway, let me start with something hopefully everyone is reasonably familiar with: integer multiplication. Or, well, I'm not saying we're good at integer multiplication. Clearly a computer can do that much faster than I can, but somehow the main idea of integer multiplication is hopefully reasonably present. Actually, I'm explaining polynomial multiplication, but that's kind of the same. Let's come to that in a second. So polynomial multiplication is like a table, right? So you write one polynomial here, you write one polynomial here, and then you multiply it in the table, or whatever, and add everything together. So, right, whatever, you write one here, one right here, and put everything in the table, multiply the corresponding terms, and add everything together, right? It's a grid multiplication. And that's why it has n squared operations, where n is essentially the degree. It's because you put it in a grid. If you put it in a grid, something is a square. N times n times n is the square, is n squared. I hope that makes some sense. And if you don't know what this capital O notation is, just read it as like the worst case scenario. So we roughly need, well, kind of roughly worst case scenario. So you roughly need n squared steps for this type of polynomial multiplication. And the same for integer multiplication, where n is now not the degree, but kind of the number of digits. And this becomes clear if you write just an integer in terms of whatever, 1, 1, 2, you could write that as 1 times 100, which is really 10 squared, plus 1 times 10, plus 2 times 10, 10 to the 0. So let me just do 10 to the 0, 10 to the 1, 10, well, yeah, 10 squared, I guess, and so on. So if you write it in terms of the digits and take the base out, then integer multiplication works exactly like polynomial multiplication. So how would you multiply 10 times 10, for example? That's a very boring example. So just split off the digits, just multiply them in the grid shade. You get a 1 here, you get a 0 here, you get a 0 here, you get a 0 here. Same as here. So this is the x squared term. X squared is our base, so base term, so it's 100. So whatever I say about polynomial multiplication is immediately true for integer multiplication as well. Just keep in mind you do it like in this digit type fashion. Okay, but what we see here is that integer multiplication, polynomial multiplication, is a grid type operation. So it's n squared, right? Grid type operation. Oh, wonderful. And it's not immediately obvious why there should be a better way of doing it, but there is a better way of doing it. And actually there's a much better way of doing it. It's not like a little bit better, it's like much better. Yeah. And if you just think about how often your phone will do integer multiplications per second, if you can speed that up, that's actually practically quite useful, probably. It's not, what I'm going to tell you is not, but we come back to that later. But for now, just speeding up integer multiplication, making it faster, seems to be a very applicable thing to do, right? Essentially everything is integer multiplication at one point. And here's kind of the main idea. It's kind of very strange. So if you just have it in a grid, it's kind of, yeah, okay, that would work. But to come up with this idea is pretty brilliant. And it's somehow related to this, one of my favorite theorems, and we'll see that. Favorite theorems of the century, and we'll see that as we go along. But essentially, you want to multiply two coefficient vectors. Well, really, I just take now as I did it here, I just take the coefficients, and I just remember my coefficients. And I could do that in a standard way, and that's our little square operation. And I get a coefficient vectors for the product. Fine. But let's say there's a better way of doing it. It's kind of like this little shortcut. Yeah, a shortcut. A detour. Exactly the opposite of a shortcut. A detour. And actually, it is a shortcut and a detour at the same time. Let me comment on that. So let's say you could turn the coefficient vector in some different data, and then the multiplication step is just a component-wise multiplication. So component-wise, so whatever, here you have something and you multiply it with something component-wise. It's really just a one-dimensional operation where you just match each component with each component and you get a new thing down here. So this is really a 1D operation. So really, this should be in O of n. Yeah? It's not a 2D operation. We do it component-wise, point-wise. Yeah? It's a 1D operation. You save 1D. So you save quite a bit of time if you could do that. Yeah, so if you could turn a 2D operation into a 1D operation, you save quite a bit. So the only interesting part is how expensive is actually this turning something into. Yeah, so, and that's one of the main, that's kind of one of the algorithms of the century. And I already cheat here because it's already here on the slide, but I will comment on that later. For now, essentially, you should just assume that there is an operation such that our polynomial multiplication will become this type of thing, right? You send it over. This is like this. Maybe I shouldn't use red. Maybe I should use blue. Blue, a very nice blue. Maybe I should use black. So you send it over. You multiply pointwise. It's a kind of cheap operation, and you send it back. So sending it back is this inverse operation. And if they are all really cheap, then the result, computing f times g, and with computing f times g, computing integer multiplication, should be actually way cheaper than you think it is. Yeah, doesn't make sense? So here you have a 2D operation, which is like a 2D operation, it's n squared. And here you have a 1D operation. So if the communication between them is cheaper than the 2D operation itself, you should be actually really good off, right? Makes sense? Hopefully that makes some sense. And this thing here is usually called the discrete Fourier transform. Yeah, DFT. And the little omega is referring to the underlying group. So the omega is usually a root of unity. And the underlying group is Z mod n. I'm not going to explain too much how it works because I don't have much time, but I give you a really nice video reference in a second. But this DFT, that people discovered in, well, DFT is a discrete analytic thing, discrete Fourier transform, classical analysis, something you actually maybe learn in school, depends a bit where you are going to school, I guess. But it's one of the standard topics in your first calculus class. So that's been around for quite a while. And this is a discrete version of it, and we'll run it in a second. But essentially the Fourier transform translates between two types of operations. One of them is a pointwise operation, yeah, so the component-wise operation, which people call the convolution, and the other one is the standard multiplication. Exactly like in our picture. It should be exactly like in this picture, right? Here's a standard multiplication, here's a pointwise multiplication, and there should be a way to kind of go from one to the other. In classical analysis, this is done by the Fourier transform. And in discrete analysis, this is done by the so-called discrete Fourier transform. And essentially, I show you what this convolution operation is by running some animations, which I obviously just stole. So let me try to make this a bit bigger. Okay, so convolution is an operation between two functions. Here the blue one and the red one, and the result is a black one. And let's just run it. So the blue times the red is the black function. Yeah, okay. Blue times red is black. And how do you get black? Black measures the area under putting blue on top of red. So let's see that. So no area, no function. Area increases. Area decreases. No area. Hope that makes some sense, right? The area underneath is sliding over one of the other. This is a very low resolution animation, but I think it's a really good one, right? So sliding over, the area increases, and that's the convoluted function. Very good. Here's another one. A little bit higher resolution. So sliding blue over red, and this is the area underneath. Sliding blue over red. And as soon as they don't touch anymore, area is 0. Very nice. Convolution. Convolution of f and g in classical Fourier analysis, like standard analysis. And now the discrete version, which is really just the same. Discrete time convolution. So this is the best I ever found on this. So if you go to the Wolfram demonstration project, you can actually download it. It's pretty cool. So here are credits for this one. And it works as follows. So it's kind of the same idea. So you convolute this function over this function, and you just do it discretely. They are now just points instead of real functions. But you really just do the same. You slide it over. At this moment, you just can't see it. Just down here. This is very, very, very slow. Why is this so slow? Aha, I see. I need to click here. Very good. And now let's go back. So here's the function, and right now they don't touch, so the output function is 0. So we slide it over, still no touch. Now I hit this point, so I get a little bit of an output here. Yeah. Now there's no new input, so I stay where I am. But now I get a negative input, so I should jump to down, okay? And there's no new input, so I should stay where I am. Very good. So this is just a straight function, so just a line. A line made out of points is discrete. And now we get more and more, so I should jump up more and more. And then it jumps up even more, right? The area increases and so on and so on. And you can just literally see the discrete Fourier transform at this point. It just slide. It's the same idea. You just slide points over points instead of functions over functions. And that's the discrete Fourier transform. Yeah, so very good. So that's what it is. So just essentially it's a discrete version of the Fourier transform. Discrete Fourier transform, discrete analysis. And this gave us, with a lot of work, because then people were thinking about how efficiently do we actually get our discrete Fourier transform in this type of picture. And it turns out that the algorithm, it's called the fast Fourier transform, and nobody calls it the fast Fourier transform. Everyone calls it the FFT. So the FFT computes it in a really, really fast way. So much faster than the line itself, the square itself. So it's O n log n. And if you don't have a good idea how fast O n log n is, so I have this picture which I just pull in a little bit bigger. Essentially n squared is filling out the square. And n log n, if you do that, so this is n, it's just a diagonal, right? So n is just one dimensional, it's a diagonal, and the log here is indicated by this very tiny line. So you can think of n log n being essentially the diagonal with a little bit of fuzz around it. So it's really fast. It almost is a one-dimensional problem. It just has a little bit of fuzz around it. And this is, well, fine. By the way, I stole this picture from one of my favorite books, Modern Computer Algebra. Really fantastic if you want to give it a read. So this picture is stolen from there. And from there, you get this fantastic result, which is one of my favorite theorems. It's one of the most important theorems, I claim, in mathematics in the past, 6 years, I guess. I think it's from 2019. I might be wrong. Let's just say the last 10 years, to be sure. Is that integer multiplication is not n squared. It is much, much faster. It's almost one-dimensional. It's just ridiculous. This is a ridiculous theorem. Just think about it. Just theoretically, it's just really, really amazing. And this result, if you want to Google it, let's zoom in here. So integer multiplication is a famous, well, by now famous result due to Harvey and van der Hoeven. I didn't want to actually click on this. So here, for example, this is kind of a very famous paper. Not so bad to read. So integer multiplication with the obvious title. It's absolutely brilliant. So from when is this? From 2020? Yeah, okay. So let's say in the last 10 years. But I also highly recommend, so I think one of them, Harvey, gave a talk, which is here online. It's a math talk, but it's still very enjoyable to follow this talk. It was very nice. It was done at the UNSW in 2019 or something. It's really, really beautiful. Link in the description, and you get way more details how this actually works. So I kind of completely oversimplified it, but essentially my picture here is what you should have in mind, how this goes, right? So you have the classical one, but you can kind of take this detour, which is not really a detour, which is actually a shortcut because this guy is so ridiculously fast. And that one is a fast Fourier transform, which is one of the, clearly one of the most important algorithms of the last century. Yeah? The fast Fourier transform. This was just one application of the fast Fourier transform. It's really amazing. I didn't really tell you how the algorithm works. It would have been too much, but again, I highly recommend this video of Harvey, I think, that I was just talking about. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I also hope to see you next time.